So I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult at the age of 24, and the process of getting diagnosed was a lot different than what I expected it to be. In this video, I'm going to explain the process that I went through to get diagnosed. If you want to go straight to the diagnosis portion of this video, just go here. But first, here's some backstory of the reason why I was diagnosed in the first place. So I was always a good kid in school. What this means is I showed up, I did pretty well on tests, I behaved, and I did my homework, but I was never actually a great student. When I was in the third grade, I noticed that for some reason I could not read any books at all. I had the ability to read, but if I was instructed to read books in class or for homework or for the purpose of writing a book report, I just wasn't able to do it at all. In fact, when it came to writing book reports, I wouldn't even actually read the book. Instead, I would just summarize the pictures that I would see on each page, since at that time I was reading picture books. When I went to middle school, I had the same problem, except it was a little bit worse now since I was older. I was still kind of able to BS my way through assignments, but now I was at the portion in my schooling where we were starting to read books out loud in class. In English class, the teacher would read through the book out loud while everyone followed along, and at random points, the teacher would call out a student's name and ask them to continue reading. I absolutely hated this because my mind would constantly wander off, and I had no idea where we were in the book when my name was eventually called out. This type of behavior began to become prevalent throughout all of my classes. I noticed that I was never actually present in class, even though I was physically there. I would even take notes and I was still completely lost in class. I would try so hard to pay attention, but I would never really understand what was going on. So in order to actually pass my classes, I would have to spend so much time outside of class studying and reading over my notes. Even after spending all of this extra time every day, I would still barely just pass my tests. Once I got into high school, things started to change a lot. Now I basically had the ability to just leave whenever I wanted to. And once I was a junior and senior, I would basically just go to some of the classes that I had scheduled throughout the day. And then eventually when I got really bored or my mind got exhausted, I would just leave for the rest of the day and go home. Again, I did pass my classes, but my grades were never really even that good. However, I was still able to pass just by doing the bare minimum. Well, eventually I passed, I graduated, and I went on to college. As the things that I was learning in college became difficult, I could no longer BS my way through everything. I was starting to fail my tests. This led to me trying harder and harder and harder, but there was still no change in my grades, and I would still get the same results. I started going to tutoring where I would spend hours trying to understand the classwork, and I would eventually get so frustrated from not understanding what was going on that I would just lie to the tutor and just tell them that I understood so that I could just leave. Well, I did this for 2 years and it didn't work, and eventually I just dropped out of college. I felt like a loser because I tried so hard to get good grades, but it didn't matter because no matter what I tried, nothing changed. After I dropped out, I spent a year working different jobs and really feeling like I was lost in life. I started to think about how I was trying so hard but just kept failing. Eventually, that just led me to ask myself, what is wrong with me? So I started Googling some of the symptoms that I was experiencing throughout school. These symptoms were things like daydreaming, not being able to focus, not being able to retain any of the information that was being taught to me, and so on. This led me to discover what ADHD was. By this time, I wanted to go back to college for a different major that I was really interested in, but I didn't want the same thing to just keep happening where I was failing and not doing a great job. So before registering for classes, I made an appointment to see a psychiatrist. I didn't necessarily go to the doctor with the intent of getting a diagnosis. I actually thought the doctor would just tell me that there was nothing wrong with me and I was lazy and I needed to just try harder or try something different. That's not what actually happened. The doctor asked me why I was there for the appointment, and I started to explain some of the symptoms that I was experiencing. He then gave me a questionnaire to fill out and asked me to answer the questions very honestly. I don't exactly remember how many questions there were. There were probably between 15 to 25 questions that I had to answer. And I don't exactly remember the questions that were asked, but I just looked up a questionnaire online and some of the questions sounded about right, so I'll read a few of those. One was, how often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations? When you have a task that requires a lot of thought, how often do you avoid or delay getting started? How often do you fidget or squirm with your hands or feet when you have to sit down for a long time? And how often do you make careless mistakes when you have to work on a boring or long project? This was the overall nature of the questions that were asked. I don't think I answered very often to all of those questions, but I did for most of them. After that, the doctor looked over my sheet, and based off of that and the questions that he asked me before the questionnaire and some of the things that we talked about, he made a diagnosis. And he told me that I have ADHD, and that was basically it. It wasn't stressful or nerve-wracking. It was really just a simple test and a conversation. I don't remember if it was that appointment or the next appointment, but we discussed treatment options and talked about medications. He explained the different medication options, how they worked, and eventually made a decision on what to prescribe me. The decisions to go to a doctor and eventually get a diagnosis made a lot of improvements in my life. Later that year, I re-enrolled in college where I did extremely well. I did so well, in fact, that the guidance counselor that I had recommended that I actually take more classes than what was necessary to be full-time. And so that's what I did. After about 2.5 years, I graduated with honors and I had a bachelor's degree. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like I could accomplish anything that genuinely interested me. I gained confidence in the ability to meet my goals. And that's it. That is my diagnosis story. If you would like to see more videos like this about ADHD, please go ahead and subscribe.